Sometimes it can be hard to imagine what life was truly like back in the medieval period. A lot of the time, castles and stately homes built centuries ago will undergo renovations and reconstructions over the years, reflecting the wealth of the family and the changing architectural styles. But there's one place in particular where you can walk through a building that has remained relatively unchanged since its construction in the 15th century, Gainsborough Old Hall. Wandering through the Great Hall or exploring the medieval kitchens, you could be forgiven for thinking that you might round a corner and come face to face with some Tudor aristocracy. But for some people, that's exactly what they claim happens, because Gainsborough Old Hall is rumoured to be haunted by multiple ghosts from its past. Gainsborough Old Hall is located in a town called, funnily enough, Gainsborough, which is in Lincolnshire, about half an hour away from the city of Lincoln. And in 1460, a guy called Thomas Burghs II inherited the manor at Gainsborough that originally stood on the site. And we know that there definitely was another building on the site before the one standing now, as there have been archaeological digs that have found evidence of this. But over the next couple of decades, he would set about pretty much completely rebuilding the house to fit his rising reputation in high society. Because the Burghs family, they were very well-to-do, so obviously they needed a house to reflect that. He went about building a huge great hall, which was basically like the centerpiece of the house, with wings on either side, and then coming out at right angles to make private apartments for the family and visitors to retire to. And Thomas, he really was this star on the rise because he was clever about it. He was knighted by King Edward IV in 1461 after serving as a soldier in his army. In 1463, he married a woman called Margaret Ross, who came from a very aristocratic family, so that boosted the borough name again. So Thomas's allegiances moved with the times when King Richard III took to the throne. He actually even visited Gainsborough Hall in October 1484. But when one king falls and another takes his place, this time in the form of Henry Tudor, Sir Thomas Burghs was ready and waiting to serve his new king's every need at court. This trusted relationship that Thomas had with King Henry VII earned him the title of First Lord Burghs. All that hard work paying off, he's now an extremely important man in the royal court. And that's not to say that Sir Thomas was a brutal, cutthroat, all-or-nothing ambitious man, like career over everything. I mean, he was clever, switching his allegiances when it was beneficial to him, so that he could maintain his standing and keep climbing up the greasy pole in social hierarchy. But looking at his will after he died in 1496, he seems to be a reasonably decent man. He loved his wife, he was generous to his kids, and he seems to have treated his servants relatively well. He was also a religious man, leaving money to various different nunneries and friaries. So it seems like, at least as far as the history books go, he was an okay guy. After his death, the estate passed to Thomas's eldest son, Edward, and the plan was that he was going to continue the progress that his father had made. Edward was going to continue to be a trusted member of the king's court. But it didn't pan out that way. It started off okay, like while Thomas was still alive and there to help his son along. Edward was knighted after fighting in the Battle of Stoke Field, but at some point after his dad had passed away, he and the king had a falling out. Edward was actually imprisoned for a time in 1497 and had massive fines imposed on him. Reading between the lines, these fines are kind of a way for the king to clip the Burghs family's wings in a way, so they have less resources to, I don't know, say raise a rebellion against the king, which apparently there were rumours at court that that may have been what Edward was trying to do. That's all just a bit of conjecture though, because I don't actually think we know the real reason why these two had a falling out in the first place, but heavy fines were a tried and true method that King Henry VII had used to keep the nobles in check. And we don't know if Edward Burghs' mental health had been in decline and that was the reason why he got on the wrong side of the king, or whether this imprisonment and subsequent fines were what caused Edward to be declared insane in 1510, as he was recorded as being, quote, distracted of memory. When Edward passed away, his son Thomas took over as man of the house at Gainsborough, and his eldest son, Edward, look, I know that there are a lot of Thomases and Edwards, hopefully you can kind of follow along, but this Edward, he actually married Catherine Parr, who you may recognise as the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII. But that's jumping the gun a little bit, because in 1529 she married Edward Burghs and lived at Gainsborough Hall until his death in 1533. Because he died young, he might have had poor health, and so he didn't even survive his dad Thomas. By 1540, the estate was no longer the Burghs family HQ, they'd moved to Suffolk, where Thomas's, so Edward's dad's second wife was from. But that's not to say that Gainsborough Hall was completely abandoned, actually far from it, because in 1541, King Henry VIII and his wife at the time, wife number 5, Catherine Howard, actually stayed at Gainsborough for 3 days as part of their northern progress, which was basically where the entire entire royal court up and went north to show royal authority and strength. And there was a little bit of drama that went down here concerning our Queen of England at the time. It was rumoured that the Queen was, quote, indiscreet at Gainsborough Hall, which continued when the royal court reached the city of Lincoln. So basically, she was having affairs. Like, that was the reason that she was executed. After King Henry made himself a bachelor again, he crossed paths with Catherine Parr in 1543, after she had not long lost her second husband, so the husband after Edward, so she was fairly recently back on the market too. And of course, she would go on to marry King Henry VIII and would outlast him as he died in 1547. But going back to Gainsborough Hall, it continued to be passed through the generations of the borough family. But because the family had other estates and interests, just like many rich families of the time, nothing major was really done to the building. And by the late 1500s, the head of the borough family household, another Thomas, he had debts that were piling up. So in 1596, Gainsborough Hall, the family seat of the borough since 1460, was sold to another family, the Hickmans. William Hickman, he was the first to take on the hall with him and his second wife Elizabeth. They were ready to breathe some new life into the house. It had been owned by the boroughs for so long and no one had really done anything to it. Obviously the reason that they'd got rid of it anyway was because of debt, so they weren't really in a position to invest money into it. But the Hickmans were, so they did some renovations, encased a lot of the building in brick, and inside decorated it to their tastes and the fashions of the time at the end of the 16th century going into the 17th. We're talking the oak panelling, the tapestries hanging on the walls, like things like that. One thing to know about the Hickman family is that they were super devout Protestants, and it's thought that in the late 1590s, William Hickman opened up Gainsborough Hall to a guy called John Smith, who would preach sermons to a congregation known as separatists. And some of these people would eventually board the Mayflower in 1620 with the hopes of settling in New England. So for my American friends watching, maybe you can trace your lineage all the way back to a connection with Gainsborough Hall. But back with the hall itself, it continued to be the Hickmans' main family home until 1730, after which it was given a new life. Because over the next couple of centuries, Gainsborough Old Hall would kind of be used as, I guess you could call it a mix of a commercial building / community centre. And also apparently it was around this time, the 18th century, that Gainsborough Hall started to be called Gainsborough Old Hall, as I'm guessing this was one of the oldest buildings in the area, and with new buildings popping up around it, it might have needed some distinction between new and old. But anyway, by this time, there were businesses and workshops that leased parts of the building, and the upstairs were converted into lodging rooms that people could rent out. And then in 1790, the Great Hall was actually turned into a theatre for the town, which makes sense. It was a huge room, plenty of space for seating, and obviously the stage. They even put up theatre boxes and a proper gallery, and it became this really popular spot in town. Loads of lectures, theatre performances, even parties and grand balls. By 1896, there was also a Masonic lodge in part of the old hall. Like, the building just had such a variety of functions. And if you don't know what a Masonic lodge is, it's basically the meeting place of the Freemasons, which is like a secret society that's not so secret. But even with all this business going on at the old hall, all of these different uses for businesses and community, all of these people coming and going, the building itself wasn't quite being looked after. After the Second World War, there was talk of pulling the building down entirely. It was in such a bad state. And over the years, the grounds that used to make up the Gainsborough Old Hall estate had gradually been built on, so now it was pretty much surrounded by housing anyway. So some people actually wanted to flatten it and put a car park in there. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and in 1949, the Friends of the Old Hall Association took over responsibility for the building. And these volunteers put in the work, did fundraising to complete the very much needed restoration to the Old Hall, which included opening it up to the public as a visitor attraction. 20 years later, in 1969, Gainsborough Old Hall was handed over to the state, and nowadays it's looked after by English Heritage. And now it's run as a museum. Like, there's little interactive bits, I think, for like kids and big kids to play with and learn about the history. Like, you can walk through all of the rooms and see what it would have been like. And it's also still used for community events. And you can even get married there. I haven't yet been myself. It's obviously on one of my places to visit, purely because I want to see the kitchens. The whole house is one of the best preserved timber-framed late medieval manor houses in the UK, and the kitchens, they've been pretty much completely unchanged from when it was first built. You can see these huge open fireplaces which would have been used to cook an entire ox. You can just imagine how busy a kitchen like that would have been, how there would have been all sorts of people running about, cooking and preparing food, roasting a whole ox over the fire in preparation for a feast, maybe like while King Henry VIII was visiting. Like, that's the sort of thing that I'll nerd out over. But obviously, I will also be keeping an eye out for anything potentially paranormal that may or may not be going on, because apparently it's not unusual for staff staff members to witness weird light anomalies as they're walking through the building, or they'll hear disembodied whispers when they know that there are no visitors in the old hall. But if you walk along the East Ranges corridor, which is where the Borough family's private apartments were, also where Richard III stayed in the gallery room, and then on the other side of the corridor in the tower bedchamber where Catherine Howard slept, you can just imagine how important this part of the old hall would have been, naturally. But this corridor itself in the East Range has also earned itself a name, the Ghost Corridor, because it's said to be haunted by the ghost of a grey lady. Her legend started in the Victorian times when a man was found lying in the corridor just completely dazed, not at all with it, and he kept repeating over and over again, "She is there." Okay. When the people who found him eventually brought him back round to reality, this guy managed to tell them that he'd seen a woman wearing a grey Tudor-style dress, and she'd appeared in front of him from seemingly nowhere, and at first she seemed relatively friendly. She was smiling at him and beckoning him to follow her through the walls. Obviously a living flesh and blood man cannot walk through walls, and that's aside from the fact that this poor man was probably scared out of his skin, and so when he inevitably didn't follow her through the walls, she allegedly turned angry, which caused this man to fall into a fit in the middle of the corridor. There was also another encounter later on in the 19th century, as there was a guy called William Rose, who was a lodger at Gainsborough Hall from 1856 to 1873. And one day he was with a group of his mates, and the conversation turned to how William could play the accordion, and his friends wanted him to go grab the instrument so that he could play for them. So William just goes, "Say less, let me just go and grab it." So he starts running up the stone spiral staircase to his room to go and pick up the accordion. But as he got to the top of the stairs, he saw a young woman, wearing a long dress, walk slowly across the room. He doesn't say whether this figure of the woman actually looked at him or interacted, or whether she was just walking, but obviously this absolutely terrified William, who knew for a fact that there should be no one up there in his space, let alone this woman wearing a dress that didn't appear to fit the time period, walking slowly across his room. Seeing this alleged apparition terrified William so much that he actually lost his footing and tumbled all the way down the staircase, and he landed in a heap at the bottom of the stairs, where his friends obviously rushed over to him to help him up and find out what had happened. So that's a very weird encounter, but those are usually the best, aren't they? Well, obviously not falling down stone stairs, like preferably don't injure yourself during your paranormal experience, you know? But when you're least expecting to see a ghost, and boom, there they are. But just as a side note on William Rose himself, just because I found this quite interesting, so you might too, he ran a company called the Rose Brothers, which he obviously ran with his brother Alfred, and they invented a machine that could wrap differently shaped sweets. And so because of that machine, Cadbury's actually named their box of chocolates Roses after the Rose Brothers company. The more you know. But back to the ghosts, because those aren't the only alleged encounters with the Grey Lady. There was also a plasterer in the 1970s who was working in the old hall, and he decided to stay late on his own to finish up one night. After that night though, his mates didn't see him on site for a few days, which was a bit odd. When he eventually came back, he told them that he'd seen a woman, again dressed in that grey Tudor dress, and being on his own, a bit later in the evening, he had been absolutely terrified and hadn't wanted to come back. That's just how scared he was of what he'd seen. So all of these stories are obviously all adult men who have allegedly encountered this apparition, but apparently she more often than not appears to young children. And what's really interesting is that these children will sometimes start talking to something that their parents can't see. So then the parents will ask, "Who are you talking to?" And the kid will respond, "The lady standing right there," as if it's the most natural thing in the world. There was one story of a woman who'd taken her young daughter out for the day to the old hall, and her daughter was just under 2.5 years old, so still pretty young, and they were walking up one of the staircases towards the bedchambers when this woman's daughter says, "Mummy, follow the lady up the stairs." "Sweetheart, there is no one else on the stairs right now. Stop creeping mummy out." But the mum just responds, "What lady?" So then the daughter goes, "That lady there, she wants us to follow her." In that tone where you've just asked a kid the most stupid question in the world and now they have to dignify it with an answer. Because what do you mean, what lady? The lady that is very clearly standing in front of us, duh. But apparently later on that day, this kid also saw a man that wasn't there and also saw the building was on fire at one point. So it sounds like the little girl was definitely seeing something, although I never came across any record of there being a fire at the old hall. So maybe it might have just been more of her imagination. I don't know. But this grey lady, she's allegedly been witnessed over and over again, almost always in the East Range corridor and almost always disappearing through a wall. So it was a very interesting detail when sometime either in the 50s or 60s, when some of the restoration work was being done on the building, they just so happened to strip back the plaster on the section of the wall that the grey lady was most often seen disappearing through to find that there used to be a door there at some point and that it had been sealed up. So that's just a very interesting detail to this story. And as for the grey lady's identity, it's not a 100% for sure sure thing that we know exactly who she is, although a lot of places online say that she is Elizabeth Burgh, daughter of the Thomas Burgh, who was the grandson of the Thomas who built Gainsborough Old Hall. Because historical records actually have it that this Thomas, Elizabeth's father, wasn't a nice man. He actually had quite a bad temper, he could get violent, and basically all of his kids lived in fear of what dad was going to do next. And so the story goes that Elizabeth, she fell in love with a soldier, which I don't know if you've gathered from listening to me talk about the Burghs so far this video, but these were very well-off people, very rich, very high in society. For a Burgh daughter to fall in love with such a low-born soldier, absolutely not. That is never going to happen. Forget it. And the story here breaks off into two versions. One version says that Thomas caught wind of their plans to elope in secret, and so he locked his daughter in the tower where she died of a broken heart. The other version says, again, Thomas heard what was going to go down through the grapevine, and so he went to the meeting place where the soldier was expecting to meet up with Elizabeth, and basically told him, look, there is no way you're marrying my daughter. I'm going to pay you some money so that you can go start a decent life somewhere else and never come back round these parts again. Or I can kill you right here, right now. And so the soldier took the money and was never heard from again. And Elizabeth, obviously being so heartbroken at being stood up by her lover, locked herself in the tower where she passed away. And it's said that she is now the one that haunts the East Range of Gainsborough Old Hall. And I mean, origin story like that? Love, drama, scandal, dying of a broken heart? That's got all the hallmarks of a good ghost story, right? But here I come along to ruin it, I'm afraid. It could be that it's another daughter. I mean, on the old Gainsborough Hall website, they make no mention of it being Elizabeth Burgh. They just say a daughter of the Lord of the Manor, which, keeping it vague like that's smart. But from what I saw, it can't be that particular Elizabeth Burgh, because she's recorded as becoming a nun along with her sister Dorothy. No being locked up in a tower, no dying of a broken heart. But regardless of that, the Grey Lady is still seen with somewhat regularity. So although we can't be sure of who she is, there are plenty of witnesses out there who are adamant that she is definitely wandering those corridors. But she's not the only one. In the West Range, there have apparently been sightings of a young boy who looks to be about 5 years old. And I couldn't verify this story, but sources online say that there are apparently records from the house saying that a boy that age did die at Gainsborough Old Hall in 1871. This entity has been seen around the staircase, but apparently witnesses have also seen him peering out of windows at the old hall and waving to the people below when the hall has been closed for the night and there's no one in there. And so the only story that I could find about who this child may be was that there was a story of a boy who fell from the raked seating when the Great Hall was being used as a theatre, and he landed on a spike, which just sounds horrific. But raked seating just means that the seats for the theatre are arranged on an incline, so each row is positioned higher than the one in front, so everyone can see the stage. And it just tracks with the timeline. During the 1870s, Gainsborough Old Hall would still be hosting these lectures and performances in the Great Hall, so potentially this is the same boy. But we don't know who is responsible for the potentially poltergeist activity that's been reported in one of the rooms, as there was apparently one room where you'd walk through at night, everything is where it's supposed to be, everything's fine, but you'd come back to that room in the morning when no one else was been, like you locked up and then you opened up again in the morning, and all the paintings would be taken off the wall and propped up against the wall upside down. So then you'd have to go around rehanging them all properly again. Could be a staff practical joke, seems unlikely, but maybe. Or is it some entity that maybe is unhappy with the subjects of those paintings in that particular room? Unfortunately, I don't know what room it was and I don't know which paintings. So if you've heard that particular story and you know a little bit more, please do let me know in the comments. And so it seems that while a visit to Gainsborough Old Hall is a fantastic opportunity to see how aristocracy would have lived centuries ago, you might even come face to face with a historically accurate character who most definitely isn't on the payroll as a costume tour guide. Just don't expect much conversation out of them unless you're 3 years old. So what do you think? I feel like Gainsborough Old Hall is a little gem. I hadn't heard of it before until it was requested to me. And I know today was very heavy on the history lesson, but you know me, I just don't know when to shut up about the lives of dead people. And so obviously the hall is open to the public. If you get the opportunity to go visit, please do. I cannot wait until I'm in the area and I can go and have a look around. They do also have ghost hunting companies that hire out the old hall, so you can go and investigate if that's your thing. And if you've ever been on an investigation there and you captured or experienced something, please do let me know. Or even if you've just visited, or maybe you've worked there and you've encountered the Grey Lady or something else a little bit weird. You know I want to know all of the details down below, so please tell me all of the things. Because I do do believe that this place absolutely has the potential to be haunted. It's relatively unchanged since it was built, generations of family members born, living and dying here over centuries, and with that naturally comes family dramas, high emotion situations within those walls, let alone if Catherine Howard was being indiscreet here, which eventually led to her execution. That's a huge deal. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to hear more strange encounters. But if you enjoyed this history with a few ghosts thrown in, please do let me know by liking the video. And if you fancy it, you could also subscribe. I certainly won't stop you. It helps me out and you get to see more ghostly stories when they get uploaded. Everyone's a winner. But anyway, that is enough from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. And in 1460, a guy called Charles, where the hell did the name Charles come from? His name's Thomas.